Good evening. Thank you so much for showing up in such a great number on such an incredibly short notice. I think this is the shortest notice event we have ever organized. But you will find it's well worth. Without further ado, welcome Riccardo Spagni, also known on Twitter as Fluffy Pony, talking about... Talking about why Monero is the least professional currency and why that's a good thing. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. So, I'm going to talk a little bit today, obviously, about Monero. That's not surprising. So, a little bit about me to start off with. I am the lead maintainer of the Monero software. I'm one of several maintainers that maintain various aspects of the Monero software. I live in Plettenberg Bay in South Africa, and you may know me as Fluffy Pony on Twitter and Fluffy Pony ZA on Reddit. So today I'm going to give you guys a brief primer on what Monero is and how it works, and a little bit about Monero's growth, the people that work on Monero and the structure of the project, and why we're trying to make Monero decentralized by design. So to start off, what Monero is and does, so you may know Monero is a privacy-enhancing digital currency, but how does it work? Thus begins our 3-hour lecture. So Monero focuses on 4 privacy-enhancing aspects. The first thing is we use something called dual-key stealth addresses because we want to hide where transactions are going to. The second thing is we use ring signatures because we want to hide where transactions are coming from. Then we use something called ring CT, or ring confidential transactions, to hide the amount that's being transacted. And lastly, we want to hide the originating IP address of transactions, and for that we have a project called Covery. So we're going to go through these one at a time, and don't worry, I'm not going to go into ridiculous amounts of depth and detail. If you want that, you can go visit the Monero Stack Exchange. So firstly, for anyone that is vaguely familiar with how a Bitcoin transaction works, a Bitcoin transaction consists of inputs and outputs. And at a later point in time, the outputs of a transaction that you've received, you might want to spend them, and so you spend them as transaction inputs. And this is what it looks like roughly in a Bitcoin transaction. Here are inputs, here are outputs. Now, Monero is no different. The key difference here is that instead of going to a Bitcoin address or a Monero address, let's just back up there a second. There we go. We pay to something called a dual key stealth address. So this little thing over here in Bitcoin would be the Bitcoin address being paid. And in Monero, it is instead this hex string, and nobody can derive the address from it. So in this example, which is of course hypothetical, we might have these in gray going to a person, and these in red coming back to us as change outputs. So that means that these ones in gray are going to the same person, the ones in red are going to the same person, but if you look at them, you can't tell if you look at them on a block explorer, because on a block explorer, they just look like that. So this is very important because it means that you can't look at a Monero transaction and say, ah, yes, this Monero address was being paid. And that means that even if you can figure out that you suspect that somebody was being paid by a Monero transaction, you can't prove that. Only the recipient can decode this and then figure out that this was in fact meant for them. Now, how do we hide where transactions are coming from? There we go. We use something called a ring signature. So a ring signature is basically, let's go pick a bunch of old transactions and new transactions from the blockchain, and we're going to pretend that we're spending one of them, but to a passive observer, they can't tell which of those is the real one being spent. So in Bitcoin, it doesn't work that way. In Bitcoin, an input links back to a single output from some old block or some old transaction. In Monero, it appears to be spending any one of a number of old transactions. So this is kind of, in a way, like if you had to go and find all the people that made those old transactions, and you said to them, hey, I'd like you to participate in creating a ring signature. And that would be this like interactive ring signature, which is similar to CoinJoin. But with Monero, because it doesn't require their interactivity, it just requires their public key, which already exists on the blockchain, you don't need to deal with anyone. You can do this entirely offline. Obviously, to a passive observer, they can't tell which of these inputs is the real one being spent. Now, this creates a bit of a problem because it means that Monero doesn't have a UTXO set. Monero doesn't have a set of unspent transaction outputs. In Monero, every single transaction output may or may not have been spent. Some transaction outputs appear to have been spent 20 times, and there's no way for you to tell if it really actually has been spent or not. The problem, of course, is that this could lead to double spending. So we have this thing called a key image, and the key image relates to the actual, it's basically like a public key or representation of the actual transaction that's being spent. The trick here is that this can't be decoded. You can't go and like crack it to try and figure out which one is really being spent, at least not without a great deal of computing power, which we consider cryptographically negligible as far as risk goes. So that's how we prevent double spends in Monero, or cryptographic double spends. Then, of course, we have to go and hide the value. But before we get to that, something that's very important is to understand that these over here are just public keys. And so when it comes to hiding the value, we have a commitment to a public key. And a commitment in cryptography is basically like saying, here's a representation of a number, but I'm not going to reveal what that number is. But we know that that's a representation of it. And so what we then do is, when it comes to the ring signature, we do use this thing called ring CT. It's based on Greg Maxwell's confidential transactions. And we basically sign this difference between the inputs and the outputs. And you can go, cool, the sum of all the outputs less the sum of all the inputs is 0. And you can do this because of commitment arithmetic. And then we use something called range proofs to make sure that all of these values that you've now committed to are positive values, because if any of them are negative, you could create Monero out of thin air, which would be great for you and bad for everyone else. Now, this is sort of a rough outline of how Monero's transaction, or what Monero's transaction format looks like. And the weakest part of Monero's on-chain privacy is really this bit here. How do you select transaction outputs in a way that doesn't reveal the real sender? And so, as an example of what might happen, typically people receive money in a digital currency sense, and they spend it pretty quickly. We found that people tend to spend Bitcoin, for example, within a day. There's lots of old Bitcoin that's lying around, but mostly people receive it and it moves within a day. So now this means that if you're picking old transactions to mix with, or to create a ring signature with, and you're picking a bunch of old transactions, but your one is obviously from today, it kind of reveals which one is the real one. So this is a weakness. And this is really the hardest part, because it's the most likely to leak metadata. And so in November 2014, we published a research paper, and then in January 2015, we suggested some changes. In fact, the author of the research paper is sitting over there. And we suggested some changes that could improve this and could reduce the snowball effect, where an attacker owns a large number of outputs and is able to then own a large number of outputs further down the chain, and then is able to use things like a bit of temporal guesswork to figure out where which is the real output. But this is genuinely hard. We've switched to triangular distribution to try and weight more recent outputs. We've then more recently done a recent output cut-in where we weight, we not only just weight recent outputs, but we select a large number of recent outputs to mix with or to create a ring signature from. But really, ring CT is the big thing that made this a game changer, because prior to ring CT, you could only create a ring signature with outputs that had the same value as yours, which was problematic. But more importantly, it allowed much larger base ring sizes. However, this is really an ongoing research area, and it's important to be pragmatic about that, because a lot of people, especially newcomers to the cryptocurrency world, they use absolutes all the time. They go, oh, Monero is absolutely anonymous or private. And no, it isn't. Verge is absolutely anonymous. And who we're kidding. But the reality is that this stuff is hard, and it's a constant game of cat and mouse. You figure out an improvement, a researcher goes and publishes a paper and says, that's not really an improvement. And so you're constantly playing this game where you need to improve things in order to defeat, not only defeat researchers, but defeat attackers that might be trying to figure out the flow of transactions in the chain. So more work is required and is ongoing. Now, when it comes to hiding IP addresses, this is also an area of ongoing work. So the way Bitcoin and Monero work is full nodes exist in a network, and they're all connected, or they're peered to not necessarily to all of the peers in the network, but to some peers who are then peered to other peers. And so you end up with this network that is all interconnected. Now, an attacker might set up a bunch of logging nodes, and those nodes just sit and log the time that they saw a transaction and the IP address that they first saw the transaction from. Because when a transaction is broadcast on Bitcoin or Monero or any of these networks, it's broadcast using a technique called flood fill. So what happens is you broadcast it to the nodes that you're connected to, and they broadcast it on until every node has seen it. The downside, of course, is that if an attacker is running a lot of logging nodes, they might be connected to you, and they go, okay, so this transaction was first seen from that IP address. That's obviously problematic. Now, given that this is a very complicated attack to pull off, it's not simple, but still, the fact that the attack exists is problematic. So we're busy working on something called Cryptographically, which basically builds an entire second network on top of the main network. And these lines in green over here are Cryptographically connections between nodes. So nodes have connections on normal internet and on Cryptographically, and Cryptographically is just an I2P router, so effectively these green lines are I2P connections between nodes. And the advantage here is that transactions then get broadcast over Cryptographically and over I2P, and blocks still get broadcast over normal internet. So you don't have the risk of things like isolation attacks and so on, but you're still able to defeat attackers, because if the logging node then sees where transactions coming from, even if it came directly from here to there, the fact is it's only going to have an I2P address, which is rather useless. You can't reverse that into any sort of real-world IP address. Now, Cryptographically is quite a behemoth. It's a big project. It's something we've been working on for quite some time and will continue to work on. We plan on not only adding I2P support through Cryptographically, but also adding support for Tor and other mixnets, with the hope of being able to not limit the number of mixnet options that we have or that users have for broadcasting transactions. So, the upshot of all of this is that in Monero, privacy is mandatory. And this is important because imagine you have 100,000 users of your blockchain project or of your digital currency, and you have this magical cloud of privacy. And this magical cloud of privacy is only used by 1,000 users. So what happens is those 1,000 users need to move in and out of the magical cloud of privacy. They go into the magical cloud of privacy, and maybe they pay some people in it, it doesn't matter. Maybe they pay some people normally, it doesn't matter. Because effectively what's happened is your total anonymity set, your total privacy set, is restricted to those 1,000 users at best. And if you're observing it as an attacker over a small period of time, that privacy set might be reduced to something like 10 users. And so this makes it ridiculously easy for attackers to go and target a limited set of users. And it also reduces things like the ability to say, no, that wasn't me because I'm lost in a sea of users. So mandatory privacy is very, very important. And as Bitcoin works to do things like add privacy, the Bitcoin developers are looking at ways to make it the default, to add privacy in such a way that it is the default, because without this, it's useless, it's pointless. It's a bolt-on system used by a tiny percentage of the population or the tiny percentage of the user base. Now, when it comes to evaluating privacy technology, how do you do that? Because, and this, by the way, this doesn't just apply to Monero, this applies to evaluating privacy projects in general. So the thing that I believe is that ideology is important, because the way the developers and the community and the user base approach things is really representative of how things are handled within the project and within the development community. So Monero contributors are very aware that they're responsible, at the very least, for people's money. This is obvious. But more importantly, no matter how much I say to people, don't buy Monero unless you have a use for it, people ignore me, clearly. And we know that we might also be responsible for somebody's life savings. And so we're very critically aware of the fact that if we make a mistake, we might end up costing somebody a lot of money because they didn't know how to do something and they ended up losing access to their funds. And so this weighs heavily on us. But more importantly, we know that we might be the difference between somebody going to prison or not going to prison. They might be entirely innocent, but because of something we've done and because of an error of judgment and because of a poor implementation of technology, we might end up making it trivial for them to be traced on the Monero blockchain. But most importantly, we know that because Monero is a privacy-enhancing technology and because it can and will be used and is being used in jurisdictions where people are not as free as the rest of the world, we know that we at some point are going to be responsible for someone's life, and that the technology that we're building might mean the difference between life or death. And I truly believe that any project, any privacy-enhancing project, or any project that claims to be a privacy-enhancing project but does not treat things with that amount of care is honestly not only irresponsible, but they're indistinguishable from a scam. And I think it's very important that we start evaluating projects with seriousness because there's a lot of snake oil out there and there's a lot of nonsense. And users are finding it difficult to distinguish between what is a good project and what is a bad project, and they're starting to trust their life to things that are really not particularly well engineered or well designed. So obviously, with Monero, decentralization is a big aspect, but so is Monero's growth. Now, what we've seen over the past few years is that Monero has really had a massive uptick in growth. Not talking about the price. What I really care about are things like the Monero contributor base. So how has that grown? So what we've seen is over the past few years, the number of commits per month has grown. And also more recently, instead of seeing a massive spike in the number of commits per month, we've seen an increase in quality. So we've gotten to a point now where we have seasoned contributors who are helping newcomers contribute to the Monero code base and improve the quality of their code, which is fantastic. We've also seen a massive increase over the years in the number of new contributors per month. So this is great to see as well, that on an ongoing basis, we have new contributors coming, pitching up and saying, hey, I want to work on Monero. I have rudimentary C++ skills, but I want to help. We've also seen a massive increase in transactions. And while some of this you're going to see when there's an increase in price, this has not been a perfect proxy for Monero's change in price, which is really comforting and helpful to see because it means people are actually using Monero transactionally and not just for speculation. Similarly, we've seen an increase in community stats, so things like the subreddit subscribers and subreddit traffic, where in 2015 we were doing like 16,000 page views a month, and in 2016 we were hitting sort of 500,000. When in December we did over 3 million page views on the subreddits, which is massive. And the number of subreddit subscribers as well, we're almost on 100,000 subreddit subscribers. So this shows a very vibrant, active community. These aren't bots that have been purchased to try and inflate our stats. These are actual people who are participating and commenting and talking and engaging and helping newcomers. We've also seen a big increase in the number of high availability nodes. So these are nodes with open inbound ports. And at the beginning of 2017, I took a screenshot, and we had 700 nodes, or high availability nodes, and that was pretty cool. And now, January 2018, we've got nearly 3,000 in jurisdictions all over the world, which is also extremely encouraging, especially seeing that, obviously in South Africa, Monero is completely massive because I'm there, right? But to see the increase in like other parts of Africa and other parts of the world, especially in places like China, the number of nodes has continued to increase, and that's something that we're really happy for as well, because it means that the Monero project has been built out to a point where it's stable enough to use all over. So who really is behind Monero? A lot of blockchain projects and a lot of digital currency projects nowadays have got companies behind them. There's also this cult of personality where there's a person who is easily identifiable. Maybe they troll a lot on Twitter, and they're viewed as the creator. So really, Monero is a lot bigger than that. Monero is a lot bigger than me or than any individual contributor. To give you some indication, let's talk a little bit about how Monero got started, because it wasn't launched by me, contrary to popular belief. It was launched by a guy called Thankful for Today on Bitcoin Talk back in 2014. He ended up being a gigantic douche nozzle, and myself and 6 others decided to fork the project away from him because he didn't want to listen to the community. And so we're the stewards of the Monero project, which basically means we control like the GitHub repo and the domain. That's really all we control. But the nice thing is that because we forked the project away from him, any control that anyone ever has from that point on is relative, because you know that the community can fork it away from you. So nobody's in control of anything, really. And the core team's role, like I said, is stewardship only. We don't control everything. We don't. Very few of us actually even write code ourselves, because there's so many different aspects of Monero that we tend to, and that other people tend to, that it's not entirely necessary. So, who are the people that develop code? So the Monero contributors or developers. There's a massive group of Monero contributors. Over the lifetime of Monero's, or over Monero's history, there have been over 330 people who have worked on Monero. Just over 2017, we had nearly 150 people who contributed code to Monero. So that is a massive number of developers, all working, I wouldn't say harmoniously, but all working together for the betterment of Monero. We also have work groups. So work groups are self-assembling groups of people in the community that want to do certain things. So, for example, we have a vulnerability response group where if somebody finds a bug in Monero or a vulnerability, they can report it via HackerOne. And we have a small work group that deals with those reports as they come in on HackerOne. And they're mostly rubbish, but there are a couple that are genuine and legit, and we deal with trying to figure out, is this something that needs to be fixed? How do we, if this is a real vulnerability, how do we go about disclosing it to the community and to the user base and all of that? There's things like the malware response work group that helps people who have been infected with Monero mining malware to clean their computer, to make sure that their stuff's up to date, that they've installed an antivirus scanner, that they understand the need to patch their system regularly. It goes and it helps pool operators identify mining malware and block them, because mining pools tend to suffer from a performance perspective if they're getting thousands of client connections from malware miners. Similarly, we've got the Monero Research Lab, also very self-assembling. The Monero Research Lab consists of a number of academics and researchers, and anyone can become part of that, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then the Monero community, which handles things like everything from social media to helping newcomers to Stack Exchange moderators to related projects. So this is a really big grassroots movement that consists of many, many thousands of people all contributing and working on Monero. And the reality is working on Monero is permissionless. So I sometimes get emails, or the core team gets emails from people saying things like, I'd like to do this on Monero. And we're like, okay, why are you telling us? The things like the Monero logo are licensed as CC BY 4.0. So it's an open permissive license, the Community Commons license. So you can do whatever you want with the Monero logo. You can, turn it into artwork or whatever. So this is really great, because it means that nobody needs permission to start doing something with Monero or working on Monero or building a project on Monero. But it also means that you sometimes have abrasive personalities, and that things sometimes move slowly, because decisions can't be made very quickly, because you've got so many people that need to reach some level of general consensus. And yet it's the best way to do it, and I'll explain why in a moment. The reality is that open source needs many participants. And if anyone here wants to get involved with Monero, there are a number of ways to do so. So if you are a developer, the bulk of Monero is written in C++. There is some C. The GUI is mostly Qt quick. So anyone who's familiar with the Qt framework, you're more than welcome to come along and help. There's a lot of low-level stuff that we hardly touch. And there's a lot of stuff that needs refactoring, but everything sort of progresses slowly over time. And we merge anything. And when I say we merge anything, it doesn't mean that we merge anything. Well, it almost does. But for the most part, if you're a newcomer, if you're a new developer, if you're a young developer and you're inexperienced, pitch up, go through the GitHub issues. There are a number of GitHub issues that are marked as easy. Make a note that you'd like to work on it, and then start working on it. And people will help you if you get stuck. There's the Monero Dev IRC channel, and say, well, I'm trying to do this, and I don't know what I did there, and I broke this thing. And people will try and help you. And if you end up submitting a pull request that works on Windows but doesn't work on Linux and BSD, no problem, we'll merge it. Somebody else will fix it. And then you'll see how they fixed it, and you'll learn from that. The same goes for the Monero Research Lab. It's an open group. There's no restriction anyone can join. If you've ever wanted your name on a research paper, go find a research paper that has a spelling error and correct it, and then put your name at the top. It's great. You can call yourself a researcher too. But seriously, I mean, like, you know, if you're figuring something out, figure out a break with Monero, or you figure out an improvement, write it up as a research paper. It's the best way to get peer review on it. Ultimately, those papers do get published in journals, and they do get presented at cryptography conferences. So it's a great collaborative way to do research on a privacy-enhancing project. Similarly, there's lots of non-technical projects. Monero's user experience right now is not so great. There are a lot of things that can and are being improved. So, you know, the websites are probably a great example of this. The website design itself is fine, but there's a lot of content that can be improved. There's better ways of saying certain things, and there's more concise ways of explaining things, especially to newcomers. There's diagrams that can be drawn. There's animations that can be made. There's all sorts of things that anyone who is even non-technical can do to enhance the Monero user experience. On the GUI, there's also translations. So, you know, and those need to be updated as functionality is added. And then there's external projects in the ecosystem. So bindings in other languages. Monero has an RPC interface, but we don't really have nice libraries for other languages. So even if you're not familiar with C++, if you're familiar with Rust or PHP or whatever, JavaScript, heaven forbid, then you can come along and write a library, and that helps the ecosystem because it means that somebody else can come along and use that instead of them having to rework it themselves. The same goes for merchant systems. How are we helping people to earn Monero? It's easy to spend Monero, but how are we helping people earn it? What are the systems being built out to enhance that? There's also over-the-counter exchanges like local Monero. They need liquidity. They need people buying and selling so that people who really desperately need to get on board with Monero or transact in and out are able to get on without needing to use a centralized exchange. And then, of course, there's mobile wallet projects like X Wallet, Monerujo, and MyMonero, all of which are open source and are written in various languages and can be contributed to. Now, the advantage of having this massive group of people like thrashing away at things, sometimes very slowly, sometimes very quickly, is that it's decentralized by design. So it's very easy from a technical perspective to have a decentralized network. You can have thousands of people. You can have 30,000 people all running nodes, or you can have 30,000 nodes being run by one person, whatever. That part is easy. But the thing is, how do you decentralize people? How do you make it difficult for an attacker to attack the project by attacking the people? How do you make it difficult to create a rift in the community, or when the rift in the community happens, because it will always happen? How do you make it? How do you structure things in a way that it doesn't destroy the project? And the way you do that is by focusing on the fact that people are important, but nobody is irreplaceable. Everyone is it can be replaced by someone else. So things that we try and encourage within the Monero community and within the Monero developers and contributors is Don't keep knowledge to yourself. Educate those around you. Make sure that newcomers are welcome. Make them feel useful. If they've submitted a pull request but it's not great, or they've made a suggestion but it's a stupid suggestion, that shouldn't be the knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, this is silly and that's terrible and this is horrible. How do we help people? How do we encourage them to do better the next time? Or how do we help them to take what they've done and make it into something good? Make sure other people know how to do your job. You know, if you are really good with Markdown and so you're hacking away at the website, are you sharing that with other people? Do they know how to edit that, and do they know the tricks that you've applied during your editing? Hand over responsibilities to others. If you're working on an open source project, this is generally true for any open source project. You can't hand over everything, but can you distribute the responsibility as much as possible so that no single person is a bus factor? And sometimes you need to do less to give others a chance. So when we started the Monero Stack Exchange, we were sort of hell-bent on making sure that we passed the beta with flying colors by making sure that we were asking many questions a day and answering many questions a day. And what ended up happening is people wanted to answer questions on Stack Exchange, but by the time they saw the question, it had already been answered. And so, eventually, the sort of 2-3 people who were answering all the questions learned to answer less, or at least to give a little bit of time to pass, so that more people could get involved with answering questions. And don't ever think you're irreplaceable, because the minute you do, somebody will replace you. See Thankful for Today, who started Monero. And always highlight the efforts of others, because something that I've seen that tends to happen, especially in this space, is people tend to take credit for things that they haven't done, sometimes not knowingly or on purpose or maliciously, but they just fail to give credit to others around them that made it possible. And that's really how you do that. Now, why bother? Why is this important? It's important because nobody should ever be able to control the network. But also, nobody should ever be able to introduce a backdoor. And you don't need to control the network to introduce a backdoor. You just need to be able to influence the contributors. But more importantly, perhaps no single person should mean the life or death of a project, because that's deeply problematic, considering that the work that we do is not for ourselves, but it's for the users of the project. And if anything is centralized, or it comes down to one person's vision or anything like that, original vision or otherwise, then you might end up with a scenario where you are the bus factor. So that's about all I have to say about Monero, the least professional digital currency. I'm open to questions.
Nicholas, how do you measure transactions from one exchange to the other? Is that a transaction, or people actually using it? How is that done?
So the difficulty with having a pro-private or privacy-enhancing digital currency is you can't tell what people are doing. So you can see that there's a transaction, for example, but you can't tell if it's the person just sending it to himself, if maybe he's moving from one wallet to another, if he's buying something, if he's paying for the bar tab last night. That's impossible to tell. The fact that you can't even tell the amount that's being transacted means that we can't tell if money's moving in and out of exchanges. We can't even guess that. So it truly is privacy enhancing. All we can see is the number of transactions, not any other information about them.
Can you just say something about scaling?
Sure. So scaling with blockchains in general is very difficult. And scaling with Monero is doubly difficult because Monero transactions are harder to validate and verify than Bitcoin transactions. They're also bigger than Bitcoin transactions. We have a dynamic block size limit, which is nice because it means that the block size expands as there is demand, or the block size limiter expands as there is demand. But that can also be abused. So we sort of, that's sort of reasonably tightly governed from an algorithmic point of view. I'm of the opinion that scaling things on-chain as a long-term goal is not really feasible. I think that there's a lot that we can do to improve on-chain scalability. We've implemented single output bulletproofs. which is a much more compact range-proof format that some researchers created recently. Bulletproofs reduces the size of Monero transactions by about 80%, single output bulletproofs, and multi-output bulletproofs will provide a different scale for multiple outputs. The unfortunate thing is, even there, Monero transactions are still expensive to validate, and they're still relatively large compared to Bitcoin. So I don't consider it feasible to try and pack everything on-chain. And there are a lot of developers in the Monero community who also are cognizant of this. So from a scaling perspective, whilst we will always try and make sure that people can access main chain for whatever reason they want to. If they want to build a business that works on main chain, we want to try and make sure that they can. The reality is that I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where Monero is used for buying coffee in the morning and that goes on the blockchain. It's not really feasible, definitely not considering Monero's ever-growing accumulator and the lack of a UTXO set and that sort of thing. So instead, we have to look at other options. So we're busy looking at things like building out a Lightning Network router in Rust that supports Monero, and we're looking at doing things like can we build out a sidechain, a Mimblewimble-based sidechain. So these are all things that various people in the community are looking at, myself included, because I think that what we really want to do is give people scaling options. If we build out a Lightning Network router and nobody uses it, I don't care. But if a bunch of people use it, great. They will always have the option of that or main chain or whatever.
Thanks for your talk. Are there any plans to organize some kind of Monero developer conference or community conference?
So, yeah, sure. Do you want to organize one?
Yeah,
you should. The thing is, it's with Monero being so self-organizing, I think that there's definitely it's the right time maybe this year to do a Monero conference. And there are enough entities and organizations that are involved with Monero that there could be some really interesting speakers, even if it's just talking about the challenges of building Ledger can come talk about the challenges of building a Monero hardware wallet. There's so many different aspects to that, but it's definitely the right time. And we have this amazing community who crowdfund things. So we have something called the Forum fundraising system. And you can go and say, okay, cool, I want to host a Monero conference, and in order to do so, there are a couple of basic costs I need to cover before I can sell tickets. And so I'd like to, raise whatever, 100 Monero or whatever it is to do so. And these are the milestones I'm going to hit. And then the community donates to that, and it gets held in escrow by members of the core team. And then as you hit those milestones, you go and post about it, and the community says, yeah, sure, you've delivered on this milestone, and we pay that out. So there's the ability not only to do that, but to get paid to do that. And yeah, I think it's the right time for it.
I've got two questions. Sure. So first one is hopefully an easy one. There are rumors that Monero is in fact not really an altcoin of sorts, but a scam. But I'd like some words on timing.
Sure. So obviously it is. I've got my gigantic pre-mine, which I plan on dumping in 2023. I haven't chosen the exact date in 2023. It depends on when my yacht gets delivered, because I'm planning on throwing an exit scam yacht party. And of course, you'll be invited.
Super, thank you. And second question is, with regards to hardware wallets, can you just touch on maybe some of the difficulties that a hardware wallet manufacturer would have in putting Monero on the wallet?
Sure, hint, hint. In case there's a hardware wallet manufacturer in the room. So yeah, the challenge is really is that Monero is not based on Bitcoin's code, and it doesn't even use Bitcoin's elliptic curve. So with any of the scam coins that are just copied from Bitcoin, then you've got like SecP 256K1 stuff lying around that you can use. With Monero, a lot of that has to be re-implemented, and there's not a lot of stuff there's not a lot of like low-level stuff that you can just rip out and use. But yeah, it's really, I think that's the greatest challenge. The nice thing is that Ledger, for example, and the guys that are building their own Monero wallet have done a lot of work that can possibly be borrowed from and re-implemented. So I think it will become easier, But that's really the greatest challenge is the fact that there's nothing else out there that uses Monero's protocol except Monero. At this point in time, it's not even a terribly well documented protocol. So there's definitely a lot of digging and asking and figuring out.
Hi. The community is growing bigger and bigger, and I think with that there will be more conflicts of interest within the community. So my question is, how are you going to figure that out? How do you make sure that the community finds consensus?
So it's a challenge, and I don't think it's a solvable challenge. You know, there are people who in the Monero community that think that any pursuit of Lightning Network at all is bad, as an example, and I feel differently, and there are other people who feel differently. So really, the only thing you can do is try and identify the rifts before they happen, and then sort of try and figure out ways to bring people together. You know, when the Monero community was much smaller, it was very easy to say, oh, we all think alike and we're all aiming for the same thing. But now that Monero is bigger, that's going to become substantially difficult. I think the challenges that Bitcoin has faced as it's scaled, those challenges have been many of them have been faced by Ethereum, and they will be faced by Monero if Monero gets bigger. So, you know, you can't avoid those challenges. You just have to kind of embrace them lovingly. Realize that there's going to be a lot of angry words thrown around on Reddit and lots of angry Medium posts written. And ultimately, you know, people have got to do what they've got to do. If there are a group of people that feel that forking the project is the best way to do it, then that's what they must do. You can't prevent that, and I think preventing that is deeply problematic because you're restricting people's choice. Yes.
Yeah. You've worked in a non-hierarchical way for a long time in your life. Most people in the world have come from the hierarchical side. So what's your outlook there? I mean, it's amazing that you can do a quality project like this and get this far. So does this mean you guys are going to take it all over? I mean, what's your outlook doing it this way?
I think that there's a lot of strength provided by this lack of structure, or this unstructured structure, and I think that changing that and you know, sort of trying to have any sort of top-down structure is ultimately, firstly, you're going to get pushback from the community, but secondly, it will just weaken everything. So we would never really want to try and do that. At the same time, there are members of the Monero community who are they come from a more structured background. They've worked I've worked at large corporations, so you know, I'd love to have daily stand-ups and Scrum meetings, but it's not really feasible. And it seems to me that perhaps with the work groups that we're doing now, it's much better that each work group can form whatever structure it wants. There's nothing stopping a particular work group from saying, well, you know, this is the person that's in charge. They can do whatever they want. They can fork the work group and kick the person out. They can, you know, like in smaller clusters, they can have whatever structure they want. But because it's self-assembling, it means that that there's no sort of central body saying, well, now it's time to form this work group. You know, we think it should be done, and this is the person who's in charge. The sort of famous a famous story that my dad used to tell me when I was younger is when he was a foreman, he told these two guys to dig a trench, and they were happily digging away. Then he needed to put a third person on, and the third person was kind of senior, and so he said, no, come and help them dig the trench, and you're in charge. And that was when everything fell apart. So, you know, I sort of think that with a lot of the stuff, it tends to work better as a self-assembling structure. And you can put some order around it, but you just don't want to have things too centralized and too controlled.
A relatively small question. So what I don't understand about a lot of cryptocurrency projects is the financial side of development. Because for Bitcoin Core, for example, you can link it quite closely to Blockstream, not necessarily all of it, but some parts. And for Blockstream, you can see the funding is coming from this, this, and this. What about Monero? How it's going to be in the future? How it is now? How was it before?
Sure. So Monero has always been a project that has been worked on for ideological reasons primarily, and the vast majority of contributors, even people that aren't working on code but are working in other parts of the ecosystem, do so for ideological reasons. At the same time, like I said, we have this crowdfunding system, and we use the crowdfunding system all the time. The crowdfunding system pays for 2 full-time Monero Research Lab academics. It pays for 2 full-time developers, and it's entirely crowdfunded. So they go and they raise 3 months salary, and as they start working those 3 months, they go and raise 3 months after that. And they're continuously in this 3-month cycle, and the community pitches in. I mean, when a new proposal goes up for crowdfunding stuff, especially if it's a known contributor, those things get funded within like 10 minutes, some of them, 20 minutes. It's insane. So I think that as long as we continue to keep that arrangement, and as long as people continue to work within it, we won't really need to worry about the challenges of funding and all of that. At the same time, I mean, I've got a couple of businesses. One of them is a payment gateway, and it's one of the few payment gateways that accepts Monero, and it's the only payment gateway on Shopify that accepts Monero. So there we are incentivized as a business to go and apply resources to Monero. So we're a little bit too small right now, but as we get bigger, there will come a point where we will hire a developer and his job will be to work on Monero, because obviously we're making money from the existence of Monero. So I think between companies within the ecosystem that benefit from Monero and make profit applying those resources, and then the crowdfunding system, I think that it will continue to be as distributed and as decentralized from a control perspective and a financial control perspective as possible.
I have 2 questions. The first one is how do you make decisions? Because, for example, if someone sends the code, for example, a new web page or a new text for a website, you talked about it, who makes the decision it will get uploaded to the server or not? And the second question is, I'm working on smart contracts because I love it on Ethereum, and I think a private smart contract would be absolutely awesome.
Okay, so to answer the first question, how are decisions made? For the most part, we use something called broad consensus. So if somebody submits a pull request, and there are people who go and review that pull request, and there are known people in the community, and there are a number of reviews, then we go, cool, this generally has broad consensus. No one has gone and put a negative review on. There's no real concern about this or anything, and we merge it. We have in the past had situations where we've merged something and someone's come along later on and said, I actually don't agree with that. I think it should be done differently, in which case they must go and change it. And then if we get broad consensus on that change, it'll be merged. So the project maintainer's role, really, for each of the different sub-projects is to, like the website or the GUI or whatever, is to evaluate a pull request and to evaluate the discussion or the comments on it, and decide as a maintainer, does this generally have consensus? If there's something that is where there's some indecision, then typically there'll be a long-form discussion on something like a GitHub issue, and then that long-form discussion can often continue for many months. We have developer meetings on IRC every 2 weeks, and if it is a development-related issue, then we might bring it up in a meeting. So we'll schedule it for a meeting so that everyone knows that we're going to discuss this thing, and then have everyone will go and familiarize themselves with that long-form discussion that's happened on GitHub, and then on IRC in the meeting we'll be able to have a much more fluid interaction where people can voice their strong opinion on whether they feel this should happen or that should happen, and we may, as a group of contributors at that point, decide to make a decision because it's clear that the community is going one way or the other. To answer your second question about smart contracts, yes, private smart contracts would be great. Scaling smart contracts is really difficult. See CryptoKitties. So what we'd probably, or what we are looking at are different ways of doing that, ways of doing like a decentralized assets protocol, in a way that is scalable, and that is something that I'm personally working on because I believe that that's great functionality that can be built on top of Monero without well, I mean, you're always going to run into scaling issues, but with less of the scaling issues that Ethereum has faced.
So I wanted to ask you, I've read about the proof of work algorithm that there is, I don't know if it's been mentioned, I've come late to the party, but there's been mentioned that it might get changed, and me and 2 friends are running a small mining farm, and that concerns us, of course. If there's going to be changes, how far in the future is it, and how would it influence current mining farms?
So if there is a change, I can't tell you how far in the future it'll be and what it'll look like. There has been some discussion about it. I think there are 2 aspects to it. The first aspect is if we take a fundamentally anti-ASIC stance, then the existence of ASICs would force us to make a change. We wouldn't necessarily change to an entirely different algorithm. We could just tweak the existing algorithm to defeat those ASICs, but still not really change the GPU and CPU mining scene. The performance might go up or down, but everyone's performance would go up or down the same way. There's a second discussion, and that is, do we change to something like Cuckoo Cycle? And the advantage of something like Cuckoo Cycle is that it's asynchronous, so it's hard to compute and to mine, but it's really easy to validate. And that reduces things like a denial of service attack risk. At this point in time, we don't feel, as developers, we don't feel that the denial of service attack risk is high enough for us to make that change. And if we ever did make that change, it would be something that we would work towards over several years. It would be very widely spoken about, and we would spend those several years building out the tools needed so that there are fast GPU miners and fast CPU miners and pool software and everything by the time that change happens. I don't think everyone's performance would be the same, or it wouldn't have the same relative performance with something like Cuckoo Cycle. So there might be a shift in power between like AMD and NVIDIA miners. But at the end of the day, that is something that we'd probably we might want to look at if we ever felt that the denial of service attack risk was high enough. Cool.
Right.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Riccardo. It was a pleasure having you.
Thanks very much for having me.